Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. Today we're studying Genesis chapter 8. When we come to the Bible, there's a temptation to look for some spiritual life hack in every passage, like just as God brought the animals to Noah, he'll bring blessings to us, or things like that. Now, that may sound good, and there may be aspects of truth in some of those principles, but as students of God's Word, we need to develop the discipline of simply learning what God has said and submitting to the straight message. So that's what we're going to do today as we study Genesis chapter 8. This passage has a ton of stuff in it, and some of it can be easily made into sweet-sounding principles, and some might be helpful. But rather than following rabbit trails, today we're going to study the passage as it was intended to be understood by God. So welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. My name is Russ Brewer. I'm pastor of Wellington Community Church in Wellington, Colorado. And today we're studying Genesis chapter 8 and the completion of God's judgment on mankind in the event of the flood. Now, by way of quick review, a couple days ago we were in Genesis 6 where God began to pour out his judgment on mankind for their sins. Yesterday, in chapter 7, the Lord brought the animals to Noah, and he and they and his family got onto the ark, and the storms came and the waters from below burst open. And now we're in Genesis 8, and we're coming to the end of the flood, and how these details unfolded in a way that was probably not super easy for Noah. So let's go to chapter 8, starting in verse 1. Genesis 8:1 tells us that God remembered Noah. Now, this is not as though God was absent-minded and suddenly realized he'd left Noah out in the ark. This is talking about God's benevolent care for Noah. In Isaiah 49, verses 15 to 16, it captures this idea of God's remembrance, and it says, "Can a woman forget her nursing child and have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, but I will not forget you. Behold, I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands." And so we see here in Genesis 8 that God remembers Noah, and ultimately God remembers all people. And so this is a key point because how long was Noah on the ark? Well, sometimes you think it was 40 days because that's how long the rains came down. But it was way longer than that. Let's go back to chapter 7 and track with the sequence we have up till now. Back in chapter 7 and verse 13, they get onto the ark. In verse 17, the floods came and rose for 40 days. Down in verse 24, the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. That includes 40 days of rain. Then in chapter 8, our chapter here, verse 3, the waters begin to recede, and that took another 150 days. Then in verse 6, it recedes for another 40 days. Noah sends out the raven and the dove in verse 7, waits 7 more days until sending out another dove. She comes back with an olive leaf in her mouth, which meant that the waters were receding. Then he waits another 7 days to send out the dove again. This time she doesn't come back. And so then in verse 13, Noah removes the covering of the door and looks out, and the surface of the ground was dry. Now you'd think he'd just hop on out and kiss the ground, but he doesn't. It's not until the 27th day of the second month in verse 14 that the Lord tells Noah to leave the ark. And so when you add up all of these days that are recorded in these chapters, you get somewhere between 364 and 375 days. Now, different scholars add up these days differently because we don't know how they reckon their calendar exactly, but either way, they were on the ark for about a year, and this factors into the importance of this phrase that God remembered Noah. Now, that phrase, God remembers Noah, points to the likelihood that Noah was on this ark for over a year without any further communication from the Lord. He's left in silence with his family, going up and down with wave after wave after wave, just alone in this world, drifting on the open seas without any land or any rescue in sight. And think about this. Much like in Genesis 1, at this point, the world is formless and void and covered in waters. And during this time, Noah and his family are on this ark wondering what's going to happen. They've had a year on the waters to think about God's judgment on the sins of mankind. They've heard nothing from the Lord and no doubt wondering if he's going to keep his promises to Noah and save him or if they're just going to perish on this ark. But then in verse 1, all of a sudden, a wind starts to blow all over the earth. Where I live here in Colorado, winds can be 40 miles an hour at my house, maybe even more. I live in town, and the countryside gets way faster winds. And I could tell you, wind is loud, it throws things around, and at my house, it blows things around like our grill and trampolines and playhouses. It can be pretty dramatic. And so if you put yourself in this situation, you're on this ark for over a year, you've settled into a routine, feed the animals, muck out the stalls, play pick up sticks with the kids, wonder if you're ever going to be saved, and then all of a sudden a wind starts blowing. This would have caused massive seas and waves, and the ark would be tossed all around, and this wind keeps on blowing until the waters begin to recede. And then verse 2 says, the fountains of the deep stopped pouring out water, and the rains from the heavens were restrained. And in verse 3, the waters receded continually. Verse 3 says they decreased for 150 days. And then in verse 4, 16 days pass, and on the 17th day the ark rests on this high piece of land. The waters continue to recede, and after 2 more months, the mountaintops become visible in verse 5. In verse 7, Noah sends out a raven. Then he sends out a dove in verse 8, and he sends her out again in verse 10, and she brings back an olive leaf. In verse 12, he sends out the dove again, and this time she doesn't come back. Now, someone might say, well, if she doesn't come back, looks like we're not having any more baby doves. Well, that's not the case, though, because you'll remember yesterday that there were 7 of each clean animal. Doves were clean animals, so Noah's got plenty more doves to keep them from going extinct. Now, this whole thing about sending out a bird and doves and all that and waiting and then sending out more, we might want to make this into some kind of scheme for determining the Lord's will, but it's not, and we don't want to miss this point. The point is that although the Lord told Noah to make the ark and when the waters would come, he doesn't tell Noah about when the waters would go away. The details about the ark and the rain, all that was necessary for his survival. The details about when the water would recede was not necessary for his survival. And I can imagine how discouraging this would have been to Noah. God had been talking to him, and now God is silent. People talk about the patience of Job. Maybe we should give more recognition to the patience of Noah. Noah goes through all this difficulty and waits patiently for the Lord during a year of radio silence, and it's not until verse 13 that things begin to change. Verse 13 tells us that on the first day of the first month, Noah opens the door and looks out and sees dry ground. Now, as I mentioned before, you'd think they'd rush out, but they don't. He and his family sit tight on the ark. You can imagine his family saying, "Yo, Noah, Noah, let's go out, the land is dry." But Noah waits for clarity from the Lord, and the Lord gives it to him in verses 15 and 16, where he tells Noah to leave the ark, which Noah then does. He comes off the ark, and all the animals come off the ark. And then we come to verse 20. Verse 20 introduces us to the event that we've been leading up to this whole time. We're going to talk about this more tomorrow, but it begins here in the end of chapter 8. And this is where God makes a covenant with Noah that explains why you and I are here today. And so in verse 20, Noah builds an altar to the Lord and begins to sacrifice these clean animals to the Lord. The Lord sees Noah's worship, and he says to himself in verse 21, he says, "I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done." And notice the 3 things that the Lord tells himself in this passage. First, the Lord promises to never again curse the ground on account of man. Now, this doesn't remove the curse from Genesis 3. In fact, they're different words. The word for curse that's used here in verse 21 has this idea of treating something lightly. Now, Hebrew words can mean different things depending on the grammatical form. And here, the form of this word has this idea of loathing or cursing or despising. And that's what the Lord has done here. He has willingly lost everything in this world, as in cursing it and loathing it and despising it. He lost it all in order to bring judgment upon mankind. And so the Lord is saying he's not going to do that anymore. And the second thing the Lord says in verse 21 is the word for. Now, we might think this word for is going to show us the reason why God will never curse the ground. We might expect God to be saying, "I will never curse the ground, for the intent of man's heart is finally good, and he doesn't deserve to die." But that's not what the Lord says. In verse 21, it says, "For the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth." And so this shows us that the intent of man's heart has still not changed, is still not reformed. And when God destroyed every human being, it was because that's what their sin deserved, not to reform the world. In fact, Noah wasn't sinless either. And in chapter 9, Noah shows us very quickly he's not a perfect man, and neither are his kids. And so the goal wasn't reformation. The goal was to pour judgment on the world that the world deserved, and to pour grace on Noah that he didn't deserve. And this is the reality of our situation before a holy God. From God's perspective, the direction of our heart is that every intent is towards evil continually. Now, we might not always choose what's most evil, but without the grace of God working in our lives, the orientation of our life will not be to serve God or please him. And if this is the case, then you would think that God would continually pour out judgment upon the world. But verse 21 goes on to say, "And I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done." And so even though our heart is bent on sin, God will not destroy every living thing as he has just done. The Hebrew word "as" is a fairly significant Hebrew word meaning according to. So on the one hand, this is saying God won't destroy the world again by a global flood. On the other hand, this is also saying that the Lord will not pour out the kind of judgment we all deserve. God should wipe the earth of every generation with a flood, but he doesn't because of grace. From Noah onward, when God deals with us like he does with Noah, he deals with us with patience and grace, and it's not because it's something we deserve. This means that at this point in the book of Genesis, we now have 2 key promises logged in the scriptures. First, there was the promise to provide a Savior back in Genesis 3:15, and now this promise to deal with mankind with a grace they don't deserve. And in verse 22, God gives us the duration for this promise, this covenant he's making with man and Noah. In Genesis 8:22, it says, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. This is a promise that life will continue with a degree of stability and predictability for the rest of the generations of man. We do not serve a capricious God that the ancients envisioned. We serve a gracious God who promises here to even be kind with those who rebel against him and to give them an ordered life of structure and blessings. But that's Genesis chapter 8 for today, another key chapter in the Word of God. Now, by way of review, this passage gives us several principles. 1, God cares about sin. He will judge sin, and his wrath must be satisfied. And yet, God deals with us, all of us, with grace. In fact, the grace that's inherent within this passage can only be righteously poured out on sinners if the wrath that they deserve has been satisfied somewhere else. And this points us to the cross, where Jesus satisfied God's wrath for the sins of his people. We also see here God's power over nature. From the animals to the winds to the waters, they all submit to him. And finally, we see here the exhortation to trust God in the dark night of the soul. We will all face difficult times, and we may find ourselves at times going up and down in the arc of life, not knowing what's going on. In those times, God's not abandoned us. He's not forgotten us. He is with us, he is watching over us, and he will be accomplishing his righteous will for our situation. And it's one that when we are with him in glory, we will look back and say, Lord, I agree with what you have done. I didn't understand it then, but I understand it now, and I agree with it. Well, so that's Genesis chapter 8. Such great stuff for our soul. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and until tomorrow, God bless.